Today I want to show how to use Power Automate Desktop to run an Excel macro where you pass in an argument into the function. I also want to show how to do it using PowerShell because maybe you want to split up the code. The function is simple, taking in an input value which should be a string, and then it's going to type that into the A column, and it's going to add that to the next available row. Anytime I make a function, I like to make a helper sub where I can pass in my argument that makes it easier to test, because I can now run this using F5 and it will type in a value and I can check that everything is fine. This function is already everything I want to do. I can close this and save my workbook and jump into Power Automate. I'm going to run my file where I'm going to make it visible. I don't have to nest it under a new process, but in my experience it's better to do so, because if you already have Excel open, that can produce problems later on, where Power Automate will try to open an Excel workbook in the same instance, and then you may not be able to execute macros. Now that I've launched it, I can go under the Excel tab and say Advanced, I want to run a macro, and here I just need to type in the name of my macro, which I of course remember, which is called test B, because my helper sub was called test A. And as the documentation says, if I want to pass in an argument, I need to add a semicolon and then the value. This is a text string, so I want to add in text and then I can save. And then normally I'd want to probably close my workbook where I want to save it, but I want to comment that out for now in order for us to see what happens. I can then run the code and it opens up the workbook where I can see I've added the text here. And I can add some more text. You don't have to enclose the text in quotation marks, so I can add the date like normal. This is where you could pass in a variable from your flow. I can run it again. This is something you could have run at the end of a longer program where you want to add a log to say that the flow ran on this date and at this time, and then you can save it afterwards. You could put this code in a subflow where it would be something like a log subflow. Or maybe because you want to do multiple actions at once, you could also do it with PowerShell or VB script, which is then the second part of this video. Instead of having this be my subflow, I instead want to run a PowerShell script, which I'll write in a moment. This is maybe code you want to store across multiple flows, so you might want to save this at one place and then copy it to all of your flows instead of having to copy individual steps. And of course you can copy multiple steps and add them, but maybe you find this more convenient, because this won't be a lot of code, because anytime you copy actions in Power Automate, it tends to write a lot of text. It's going to be more compact to make a PowerShell script or VB script to do these simple actions. But I would rather code in Visual Studio. I can then have my program start out by saying it's, starting. This isn't something we'll see unless we add this variable produced, and then we can, write the output, but we'll just ignore that for now. This is also for testing purposes, since I can run PowerShell inside Visual Studio Code. The first thing I need to do is, like in Power Automate, I need to add an Excel instance, which is then a new object called a com object, which is then the excel.application. And I want to make that visible. This isn't necessary, but I'd rather be able to see it, especially for testing purposes. The idea of this flow is that I want to have a logging file, so I could simply add the file path inside my shell function instead of adding it in Power Automate. So I would copy that in, see that this is the file I want to open, and then it's simply a matter of actually opening up Excel, saying that my workbook object is then, I want to use the Excel object I created up here, and I want to open that using the workbooks function, and then my file path is the Excel file. And then I can run my macro using the excel.run function, and my macro is called test B, and my test file is today's date is X, and this is something you'd want to pass in from your Power Automate flow, so I'll add that afterwards. And then I need to give credit, and then I can save my workbook, and since I actually want to show it in the video, I won't be closing the workbook. And we can then take this code and copy it back into Power Automate and say, let's grab the current date. We can then disable the actions using the basic Excel actions, because I'm now running everything from the shell script and I want to pass in my variable. And then I can test it. And it would help if I wrote com object correct, so we'll try that again. It would also help if I wrote the macro correctly, and it turns out I actually had to add the current datetime variable inside of my text string. I thought I had to add it outside, as I'm used to in something like VBA or Python, but no, it had to be added inside the text. So now that that's sorted, we can finally run the code. Say that I want to run, and then this opens and adds my date. And we can then activate this workbook.close function. And we see Excel is opened. It turns out that Excel wasn't closing properly. It did save and the actual workbook did close, but I didn't say to quit the Excel instance, which is why I had the open window of Excel, but there was no data inside because it's the underlying program. In order to do so, I add that my Excel object up here, I want to close any open workbooks. Then I want to terminate the instance itself using the quit function. And again, I can't actually see this write host part without looking at this PowerShell output. But you could then use this after the action is done in order to do some check that your log file has actually saved. I can see I open up Excel and it closes rapidly because I do very little work. And we can see in my PowerShell output, starting the program, terminating. And if you wanted to, you could add the timestamp, but this isn't necessary here. If I then go in and open, we can see I did some testing inside Visual Studio Code because I said that it should add the X, and this was my correct run after I added that the Excel instance should be closed. Lastly, I want to show that you could also run the code by creating a PowerShell file, which you simply do by making a text file, copying in the code, and then changing the file extension to .ps1. Then I can right click it and say run with PowerShell, and we can see it says starting program and it executed flawlessly. And we can also see that the date modified has changed. So